The business behind restaurant grease traps. Every night, while a restaurant is closing, there is a second business waiting underneath the floor. Not in the dining room, not in the walk-in freezer, not on the delivery apps. Under the sinks, behind the building, or beneath a parking lot, there is a container designed to catch what the sewer does not want. Fats, oils, grease, and food solids carried away with kitchen wastewater. And that container creates an obligation. It has to be maintained. In many places, it has to be cleaned on a schedule or before it reaches a certain level. Sometimes the restaurant can handle a small unit itself. Sometimes a specialized contractor has to do the work. In some cities, the waste has to be moved by a permitted hauler, documented with trip tickets, and delivered through an approved disposal system. Which means the tank under a restaurant is not just plumbing. It is the foundation of a recurring service business. A strange one, because customers do not buy the service because they love it. They buy it because grease keeps accumulating, sewer authorities care what happens to it, and ignoring the problem can eventually become more expensive than dealing with it. So the question is not whether grease trap cleaning sounds glamorous. It does not. The interesting question is why this very unglamorous job can become a durable local business, and why the same rules that create demand can also make the business surprisingly difficult to scale. Start with the problem the interceptor is trying to solve. In a commercial kitchen, fats, oils, and grease, usually shortened to FOG, can enter wastewater through sinks, dishwashing, food preparation, and cleanup. If too much of that material reaches the sanitary sewer, it can cool, accumulate, and contribute to blockages. The Environmental Protection Agency has long treated FOG from food service establishments as a pre-treatment issue because solid or viscous pollutants can obstruct sewer systems and interfere with wastewater operations. That is why grease interceptors exist. The basic idea is simple. Kitchen wastewater enters a device that slows the flow enough for lighter grease to separate from water while heavier solids settle. The water continues downstream. The material the sewer does not want remains behind. Austin Water describes grease traps and interceptors as pre-treatment devices that separate FOG and food preparation solids before wastewater reaches the sanitary sewer. Seattle gives the same underlying explanation. The interceptor holds wastewater long enough for grease to cool, solidify, and separate so it can later be removed. Nothing about that sounds like a business yet. But notice what the device is doing economically. It is converting a continuous flow problem into a storage problem. Instead of allowing grease to disappear into the sewer, the interceptor stores it at the restaurant. And storage has a limit. The moment a city tells a restaurant that this device must exist and must continue to function, someone eventually has to remove what the device captures. That is the first unusual feature of the market. Demand is attached to accumulation. A restaurant can postpone repainting a wall. It can delay replacing chairs. It can decide that a decorative sign is good enough for another year. But grease keeps arriving with the wastewater. The interceptor does not care whether the owner is busy, whether sales were weak this month, or whether maintenance is inconvenient. The contents keep building. And because the purpose of the device is to protect the sewer, municipalities have a reason to care about whether it is actually maintained. Seattle, for example, requires food service businesses with commercial kitchen plumbing fixtures and the relevant food business permit to install and maintain grease interceptors. Austin similarly requires approved interceptors for commercial and institutional food preparation businesses subject to limited exceptions. There is a useful way to think about this from the restaurant side. The interceptor is infrastructure the customer rarely wants to think about but cannot simply wish away. It sits outside the visible product of the restaurant. Diners never order grease interceptor capacity. A chef does not advertise it. Yet the kitchen's ordinary operation keeps feeding material into the device. That separation between visibility and importance is what makes the niche interesting. Many highly visible restaurant expenses are discretionary at the margin. The owner can change the menu, delay a remodel, buy cheaper furniture, or negotiate with a supplier. The interceptor belongs to another category: hidden infrastructure that exists because the kitchen connects to a sewer system that has rules. The business opportunity, therefore, begins before a service company makes a single sales call. It begins with the physical and regulatory architecture around the customer. This is an important distinction. The provider does not create the restaurant's need in the same way an advertising agency might create demand for a campaign. The need is generated by the combination of kitchen wastewater, the interceptor, and local sewer management requirements. That does not guarantee that any particular service company will be profitable. It does mean the underlying maintenance problem is persistent. And persistence is valuable. This is where a piece of plumbing becomes the beginning of an industry. The restaurant has a physical device. The device catches waste. The waste accumulates. The local sewer authority imposes rules, and eventually a service has to happen. Once the interceptor exists, it quietly creates a second obligation. Someone must keep servicing it. Most service businesses would love one thing above almost everything else: a reason for the customer to come back. Grease-interceptor service has that reason built into the physical system. The restaurant is not purchasing a one-time transformation. It is managing an ongoing process. The interceptor is cleaned, then immediately begins filling again. That makes the business structurally different from a repair company that waits for something to break. The better model is recurring maintenance. The exact schedule varies, and that matters enormously. But the important point is that many local rules treat interceptor maintenance as a continuing obligation. Seattle requires regular cleaning. DC Water publishes cleaning guidance based on interceptor type and how full the device becomes. Fort Worth requires food service establishments under its program to maintain grease traps at prescribed frequencies and keep documentation. So a service provider can potentially turn one customer acquisition into many future visits. That changes how the relationship works. Imagine two businesses. Business A sells a restaurant a piece of equipment. It earns revenue once, then has to find another buyer. Business B performs a required maintenance service. If the restaurant stays open, the interceptor remains in use, and the relationship is satisfactory, the same location can need service again and again. That recurring characteristic can be attractive even if each individual job is not spectacularly profitable. The value is in repetition. But repetition comes with a condition. The provider has to fit into the customer's operational rhythm and the local regulatory system. A restaurant does not want a disruptive maintenance event in the middle of dinner. A municipality may care about records, transporter permits, disposal practices, or how full the unit is allowed to become. A small indoor interceptor can be treated differently from a large gravity interceptor outside the building. So recurring demand does not mean standardized demand. That distinction is critical. It would be easy to imagine grease trap service as a simple subscription. Visit every 30 days, charge the same price, repeat forever. But the real market is messier. Different cities can set different rules. Different interceptor types can have different maintenance expectations. Different restaurants generate different amounts of grease and solids. And the service provider may be doing more than pumping material out of a tank. It may also be part of a compliance chain that includes inspection, documentation, transport, and disposal. Here is a clearly hypothetical example. Suppose one restaurant needs service frequently because its local rules and operating conditions push it toward a shorter cleaning interval. Another restaurant, using a different interceptor in another jurisdiction, can legally and practically go longer between visits. Even if both accounts pay similar prices per visit, they are not equivalent customers. The first account may create more annual revenue because it needs more service events. But it also creates more scheduling obligations. The second may create fewer visits, but those visits may be easier to fit into a route. Without real company data, we cannot say which account is more profitable. The example simply shows that recurrence has a shape. Frequency, predictability, and compliance requirements determine that shape. The same logic applies to customer retention. A recurring account is valuable only if it actually stays recurring. If a provider misses service windows, creates documentation problems, or becomes unreliable, the customer has a reason to switch. The physical recurrence therefore creates an opportunity, not a guarantee. And the provider's role gradually changes as the relationship matures. On the first visit, the company may still feel like an outside contractor. After repeated successful visits, it can become part of the restaurant's operating routine, the same category as pest control, hood cleaning, waste pickup, or other recurring services that management wants to happen without drama. That is when the business becomes most interesting. The provider is not merely being paid for labor, it is being paid to remove a recurring decision from the customer's attention. But recurrence is only the beginning, because the schedule is not the same everywhere. Search for grease trap maintenance advice and you will quickly encounter simple rules. Clean it monthly. Clean it quarterly. Use the 25% rule. Those statements can all be true somewhere and still be misleading if presented as universal. There is no single national restaurant cleaning interval that works as a rule for every jurisdiction and every interceptor design. Seattle provides one example. Its municipal guidance says food service businesses must clean grease interceptors when they become more than 25% full of grease and food waste. That is specific, measurable, and local. Now look at Washington, D.C. D.C. Water says the required cleaning schedule depends on the type of interceptor and the kind of food operation. Its general code-based guidance says gravity grease interceptors should be cleaned and inspected every 90 days, or sooner if they become more than 25% full of grease and solids. But for hydromechanical or flow-based interceptors, D.C. Water gives a different general interval. Every 30 days or sooner if the unit becomes more than 50% full of grease and solids. Those are not tiny differences. One jurisdiction can use a fullness threshold. Another can combine a calendar interval with a different threshold depending on equipment type. And even the famous 25% rule needs context. A grease interceptor manufacturer, Shear, notes that many jurisdictions use a 25% rule for conventional gravity interceptors, but argues that applying it mechanically to modern hydromechanical interceptors can be inappropriate because certified storage capacities differ by design. That does not mean the manufacturer gets to rewrite local law. The local authority controls its own requirements. It means the phrase 25% rule is not a magical national constant. For a service company, this matters because the rule determines the service pattern. If a customer must be serviced more frequently, that can create more annual visits. If a jurisdiction allows longer intervals for a certain type of equipment, the revenue schedule changes. If the customer's operation produces more grease and solids, the practical interval may shorten even if the code allows more time. And from the restaurant's perspective, the provider is not simply selling cleaning. The provider is helping the restaurant remain inside a local maintenance regime. That is a much stickier relationship than an occasional emergency plumber, but it is also more demanding. The provider needs to know what type of interceptor it is dealing with. It needs to understand what the local authority expects. It needs to know whether the restaurant can self-clean a small unit or whether a specialized contractor or waste hauler is required. In D.C., for example, gravity grease interceptors must be cleaned by a contractor specializing in that service. Larger hydromechanical units are also directed toward fog waste haulers, while certain smaller units can be self-cleaned. There is another business consequence hidden inside these differences. A service company cannot safely build its entire sales pitch around one universal rule. If it tells every restaurant in America, "You need us every 30 days," the claim immediately becomes vulnerable to local exceptions. The more professional approach is the opposite. Begin with the local rule, identify the device, and then determine the appropriate service pattern. That sounds less scalable from a marketing perspective, but more scalable from a compliance perspective. The distinction matters because trust in this market is built partly on not overstating what the law requires. A provider that understands the difference between a gravity interceptor and a hydromechanical unit, or between Seattle's threshold and DC's interval guidance, is demonstrating local competence. A provider that repeats a generic internet rule may be exposing the customer to unnecessary service or inadequate maintenance. From an economic standpoint, this also makes customer value harder to compare. A hypothetical account that requires 12 visits per year is economically different from one that requires 4. But neither visit count should be assumed without knowing the jurisdiction and the actual operating requirements. That is why recurring revenue projections in this niche can be deceptively simple. Multiplying number of restaurants by monthly service may look clean in a spreadsheet while being wrong in the field. The interval is not merely a pricing detail, it is a regulatory and operating variable. So the answer to "how often do you clean it" can immediately lead to a second question. Who is legally or practically allowed to do the cleaning? And that changes what the service visit really is. From the outside, the job looks straightforward. A truck arrives, a tank gets emptied, the truck leaves. But in regulated markets, the actual product is more complicated. The service provider is not just moving waste, it is completing a chain of obligations. At the restaurant, the interceptor has to be accessed and cleaned according to the applicable requirements. In places that require specialized contractors or approved haulers, the restaurant cannot treat the job like ordinary trash removal. The material has to enter a controlled transport and disposal process. Fort Worth makes this especially visible. Its food service discharge permit program requires regulated establishments to install appropriately designed equipment, maintain grease traps at prescribed frequencies, use permitted transportation and disposal companies, keep required documentation, inspect for seepage or overflow, and comply with wastewater discharge rules. Now look at the transporter side. Fort Worth also requires liquid waste haulers to obtain permits before hauling grease-interceptor waste. The city says transporters must register with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality before city permitting, and permitted haulers are subject to annual inspection. That means a grease service operator in this market is participating in a regulated logistics chain. The waste leaves the restaurant, but the responsibility does not simply vanish when the truck turns the corner. Fort Worth uses trip tickets. Before waste is removed, the transporter presents a city liquid waste trip ticket. Copies follow the transaction, including documentation tied to final disposal. The restaurant has to retain the completed record on the premises for at least 5 years. Think about what that does to the value proposition. If the provider performs the physical work but mishandles the documentation, the job can still create a problem for the customer. If the provider is not permitted where a permit is required, the restaurant may not be getting a compliant service. If disposal is handled incorrectly, the low-price contractor can become the expensive contractor. So the real service is not "make the tank empty." The real service is closer to restore the interceptor to an acceptable condition, move the waste through the required channel, and leave behind the evidence that the customer did what it was supposed to do. That is why these businesses can be surprisingly sticky. The customer is not just trusting the provider with a dirty tank. It is trusting the provider with an administrative obligation that can matter during an inspection. And that is a subtle competitive advantage. A restaurant manager already has dozens of recurring tasks: food safety, payroll, staffing, suppliers, refrigeration, pest control, cleaning, licensing, deliveries, and customer service. Grease-interceptor maintenance is not the task anyone wants to reinvent every month. If one provider shows up reliably, understands the local system, completes the records, and keeps the restaurant from thinking about the tank, the service can become almost invisible. Invisible services are often powerful businesses because the customer notices them most when they fail. Consider a hypothetical service failure that involves no dramatic spill at all. The physical cleaning is completed correctly, but the paperwork is incomplete. The restaurant manager later needs proof of service and cannot find the required record. From the worker's perspective, the tank was cleaned. From the customer's perspective, the service is incomplete because one part of the compliance chain is missing. That is why administrative quality can matter almost as much as physical quality. Another hypothetical example. Two providers offer the same visible result, an empty, cleaned interceptor. Provider A has the relevant local permit, uses the required transport pathway, and returns the documentation. Provider B is cheaper but cannot provide the same compliance trail. The restaurant is not truly comparing identical products. The visible output is the same. The risk attached to the output is different. This helps explain why relationship-based recurring services can survive even in industries where the physical task looks commoditized. Once the customer trusts a provider's process, switching creates friction. The restaurant has to evaluate a new company's permits, reliability, documentation, and local knowledge, not just compare a price quote. The paperwork reveals something important. This is not just dirty work. It is a compliance service. And the paperwork also reveals something else. This market is not one national market. It is a collection of local operating systems. Suppose a grease service company becomes successful in one city. It has customers. It understands the local authority. Its workers know the paperwork. It knows which jobs require a specialized hauler and how disposal works. Now the owner decides to expand into another city. At first, expansion sounds easy. The physical problem is the same. Restaurants still generate FOG. Interceptors still need maintenance. Waste still has to go somewhere. But the rules can change around the same physical job. Seattle has its own interceptor requirements and 25% fullness rule. DC Water publishes different cleaning expectations by device type and distinguishes situations where self-cleaning is possible from those where a contractor or FOG waste hauler is expected. Fort Worth uses discharge permits, permitted transporters, trip tickets, disposal documentation, and multi-year record retention. These are not merely technical details. They shape the market boundary. If a city requires permitted transporters, the company needs the right permit before operating there. If a municipality has specific reporting requirements, the company needs administrative processes that produce the correct records. If the acceptable cleaning schedule differs, route planning and customer contracts may have to change. That creates a form of local barrier to entry, not an impossible barrier, not necessarily an enormous one, but a real one. A new competitor cannot always arrive with a truck and a phone number and instantly become equivalent to an operator that already understands the local system. Fort Worth even states that unpermitted liquid waste transporters can face penalties of up to $2,000 per violation per day. That figure is specific to Fort Worth, not a national penalty. But it shows the principle clearly. The rules around transporting the waste can be serious enough to become part of the business model. This fragmentation creates a strange advantage for established operators. Local complexity can protect them. A provider that knows the forms, the inspectors, the acceptable process, the disposal pathway, and the customer base has accumulated something more useful than a generic cleaning technique. It has local operating knowledge. But the same thing that protects the business locally can slow it down nationally. Every new geography may require another layer of learning. Here is the analytical point, clearly labeled as business model inference rather than an industry statistic. In a standardized national business, expansion benefits from copying the same operating manual repeatedly. In a locally regulated business, Expansion requires a standard operating manual plus a layer of local exceptions. The more exceptions matter, the more headquarters must know about each market. That creates a management cost even when the physical service remains similar. The company has to answer questions such as, which permit applies here? Which customer can self-clean a small unit? What service interval is expected? Which records must be retained? Which transport rules apply? Which disposal process is acceptable? None of those questions is mysterious individually. The difficulty is reproducing the answers across dozens or hundreds of customers without letting the exceptions turn into errors. This is why local knowledge can function as both moat and burden. It discourages careless competitors because they must learn the system, but it also forces the incumbent to keep learning if it expands. A hypothetical two-city operator illustrates the problem. City 1 may be highly familiar. Every dispatcher knows the rules, every restaurant has a clear account history, and documentation is routine. City 2 may generate the same revenue per stop, but require more training and oversight during the first months because every exception is new. Without company-specific data, we cannot assign a cost to that learning curve. But the existence of different local requirements is enough to show why identical-looking revenue can carry different operating complexity. This is one reason strange service businesses can look much simpler from the outside than they feel from the inside. The core job is understandable in a minute. The operating system takes much longer. And once the operating system becomes local, the economics become local too. How much does grease trap cleaning cost? This is where internet research can become dangerous because pricing pages often present clean, national-looking numbers for a market that is intensely local. One current secondary pricing source gives an illustrative range of roughly $150 to $500 for a standard restaurant grease trap cleaning, with larger commercial interceptors potentially costing more. That is useful as a reference point. It is not a national tariff. The range can change with the size and type of interceptor, how difficult it is to access, how long it has been since the last service, local disposal requirements, and the market itself. So, rather than ask for the average profit margin, which we do not have a reliable universal source for, it is more useful to break the job into an economic equation. Revenue comes from the service visit. The customer pays to have the interceptor maintained and, where applicable, the waste transported and documented. Then the provider has to absorb everything required to complete that visit. There is worker time. There is vehicle and equipment time. There is fuel. There is maintenance on equipment that handles an unpleasant, heavy waste stream. There may be disposal costs or other local handling requirements. There is administrative labor for scheduling, documentation, permits, and records. There is insurance and all the ordinary overhead of running a commercial service company. And there is one cost that is easy to ignore when looking only at invoice price: capacity. A truck and crew can only complete so much work in a day. At this point, it is important to separate sourced fact from business model analysis. We do not have a verified industry dataset in this research that measures how much route density changes grease service margins, so we should not attach a percentage to it or pretend it has been measured here. What we can do is use a hypothetical capacity example. Imagine a crew has a workday with 3 service appointments. If the same 3 appointments can be completed with less non-billable travel, more of the crew's finite day is available for service. If the appointments are spread farther apart, more of the day is consumed between jobs. That is not a grease industry statistic. It is simply a way to visualize how mobile service capacity behaves. The same caution applies to recurring accounts. It is reasonable to infer that a known repeat customer can reduce some selling and onboarding friction compared with finding a brand new customer every time. But our research does not quantify how much that changes acquisition cost for grease service companies. So the correct language is can, not does by X%. That distinction keeps the economics honest. The strongest verified point is recurrence itself. Local rules require ongoing maintenance. The rest of the profitability equation depends on how efficiently a particular operator converts that recurring demand into completed compliance service. Consider two hypothetical $150 invoices. They look identical on paper. In the first case, the job is expected, routine, and easy to document. In the second, the unit is overdue, access is difficult, the visit takes longer, and the account creates extra administrative work. The revenue is identical. The economic quality is obviously not. Now reverse the example. A $500 job might sound much better than a $150 job. But if it requires substantially more time, equipment use, transport, disposal handling, or troubleshooting, the higher invoice does not automatically mean a higher margin. That is why the current market range is more useful for demonstrating variability than for calculating a national profit margin. The business is not charge a few $100s and keep the difference. The business is a repeated conversion of labor, equipment, compliance knowledge, and local logistics into a completed service event. And because local rules vary, two apparently identical restaurants in two different cities can impose different compliance costs on the provider. So there is no honest single answer to what margin does a grease trap company make? The better question is where the margin disappears. Imagine a perfect service account. The restaurant is easy to access. The interceptor is maintained before it becomes a disaster. The customer is scheduled in advance. The required documentation is routine. The local disposal process is known. The provider can complete the work without surprises. That is the ideal version of the business. Now, begin adding friction. The interceptor is overdue. The restaurant waited until there was an odor or backup concern. The access point is blocked. The location is far from the provider's other customers. The job takes longer than expected. The local rules require a permitted transporter or a specific reporting process. The provider has to spend more time managing the account than the invoice justifies. None of these needs a dramatic failure to hurt. Economics. Small inefficiencies compound. Again, this section is analytical rather than a claim about measured industry averages. A recurring service company has finite labor hours and finite equipment availability. Any task that uses those resources but does not create proportionate revenue can pressure profitability. That statement is a general operating principle, not a sourced grease service margin statistic. The interesting part is how regulation interacts with that principle. Fort Worth requires prescribed maintenance, permitted transport and disposal companies, and documentation. DC Water distinguishes which devices need specialized contractors and which smaller devices may be self-cleaned. Different jurisdictions can impose different schedules. That means local compliance is not something layered on top of the business. It is part of production. The company is producing a compliant service event. That phrase sounds bureaucratic, but it captures the economics better than pumping grease. If the customer only needed a tank emptied, the cheapest person with suitable equipment might win. If the customer needs the tank serviced correctly, on time, under local rules, with the right documentation and transport chain, reliability becomes more valuable. That can support recurring relationships. But it can also raise the cost of scaling because every employee, dispatcher, and manager has to understand the process well enough to reproduce it. This is where many local service businesses develop a hidden moat. The moat is not advanced technology. It is a pile of boring knowledge that prevents expensive mistakes. Which customer needs what frequency? Which unit can be self-cleaned and which cannot? Which paperwork has to be completed? Which transporter permits apply? Where the waste can go? What records the restaurant needs to keep? The individual facts are not glamorous. Together, they can become the operating system of the company. We can make that more concrete with another hypothetical. Imagine a dispatcher looking at tomorrow's schedule. One restaurant is due under a recurring plan. Another called because its interceptor is becoming a concern. A third is a new customer in a jurisdiction with slightly different documentation. The dispatcher is not merely deciding which truck goes where. The dispatcher is deciding how to use scarce service capacity while preserving compliance for every stop. If the company gets that decision wrong repeatedly, problems appear in small ways before they appear in dramatic ways. Crews wait. Customers wait. Paperwork piles up. Routes become inefficient. An account that looked attractive in the sales pipeline turns out to consume more time than expected. None of those outcomes requires an industry-wide benchmark to understand. They are examples of how operational friction can erode a recurring service model. And this leads to another useful distinction. A business can have recurring revenue without having recurring efficiency. The customer may reliably need service every month or every quarter, but if the provider has not standardized its own process, every visit can still feel like a new problem. The highest quality operating model would therefore try to make repeat work actually repeatable. Known location, known device, known local rule, known documentation, known service history. That is where the economic promise of recurrence becomes operational rather than theoretical. And there is another misconception that can distort the economics completely. People hear the word grease and assume the operator is hauling away something valuable. Maybe the restaurant pays for the service, and then the company sells the grease too. That sounds like an extraordinary model. It is also too simple. Restaurants produce more than one kind of greasy material. Used fryer oil. The relatively clean oil collected from fryers is not the same thing as the mixture removed from a grease-interceptor. Grease trap waste can include water, food solids, and degraded fats captured from wastewater. So it is dangerous to assume that every gallon removed from an interceptor is a valuable commodity with a positive resale price. Our research does not support a universal claim that ordinary grease trap operators make meaningful resale profit on every load. And that distinction matters because it changes how you think about the business. If the waste were always valuable, the service might behave like a collection business, where the material itself subsidizes customer acquisition. But if the material is primarily something that must be handled and disposed of correctly, then the economic center of gravity is the service fee. The restaurant pays because the interceptor needs maintenance. The provider earns by performing that maintenance reliably within the local system. Any downstream value recovered from particular waste streams can be market-specific and should not be treated as guaranteed. This is an important storytelling correction because used fryer oil and grease-interceptor waste are easy to confuse visually. A restaurant may have a separate container for used cooking oil, and that oil can belong to a different collection system entirely. The interceptor, by contrast, is dealing with material separated from wastewater. Those two streams should not be collapsed into one business model. If they are, the economics become misleading. You might incorrectly assume the service company wants the restaurant's waste because the waste is valuable. In reality, the verified reason the service exists is that the interceptor has to be maintained and the waste has to be handled under local rules. That changes the incentive structure. The provider is primarily solving a maintenance and compliance problem. The customer is primarily buying the disappearance of that problem. This is one reason the business can remain attractive even without a spectacular commodity story. Recurring service revenue can be valuable on its own. In fact, removing the fantasy of free valuable grease makes the business model easier to analyze. Revenue comes from service. Costs come from completing that service. Any secondary value from particular waste streams is a market-specific upside, not the foundation of the thesis. That makes this business less magical and, in a way, more interesting. It survives without needing the waste to become treasure. The underlying demand comes from the obligation to maintain the interceptor. The product is not grease. The product is removal, compliance, documentation, and relief from a recurring operational headache, which means the most valuable asset may not be what is in the truck. It may be the list of customers who trust the truck to keep coming back. Recurring revenue sounds safe until you ask where it comes from. A local grease service operator can face concentration risk in several forms. The first is customer concentration. A company may serve many independent restaurants, or it may win a large restaurant group with multiple locations. The group can be attractive because one relationship creates many service stops. But if too much revenue comes from one group, losing that contract can leave a large hole in the schedule. We do not have a sourced industry statistic for how concentrated grease service customer books are, so there is no honest percentage to quote. The risk is structural. The second concentration is geographic. Local permitting and disposal rules can make a company deeply optimized for one municipality. That local knowledge is valuable, but it also means the business is exposed to changes in that jurisdiction's requirements. The third concentration is operational. If local rules require approved haulers or approved disposal pathways, the operator may depend on a limited number of facilities or partners. Again, the exact number varies by market, but the principle follows directly from the regulated chain. When a business must move waste through approved channels, those channels matter strategically. Fort Worth shows how formal this can become. The city requires permitted liquid waste transporters and trip ticket documentation tied to final disposal. The food service establishment retains the completed record for at least 5 years. That system is useful for accountability. It also means the hauler is operating inside an ecosystem it does not fully control. A change in permit status, disposal access, documentation requirements, or local enforcement can change the operator's workflow. This is the strange trade-off at the center of the business. Regulation creates demand because restaurants have to manage FOG. Regulation also creates dependence because the provider has to operate within the local rules. The moat and the risk come from the same source. The concentration issue becomes clearer with a hypothetical comparison. Companies 1 serves 100 unrelated restaurants, each representing a small share of revenue. Company 2 serves the same number of locations, but half of them belong to one restaurant group under a single commercial relationship. Without actual pricing and contract data, we cannot say which company is more profitable, but we can say the second company is more exposed to one commercial decision. If the group switches providers, a large amount of scheduled work can disappear at once. Now add geographic concentration. Suppose most of Company 1's customers operate under one municipal program. The company becomes extremely efficient at that program. Its forms, training, and internal routines all fit the jurisdiction. That specialization is useful. It also means a local regulatory change affects a large share of the company simultaneously. This is why concentration risk is not only about customer count. It can also be about rules, permits, disposal infrastructure, or geography. A service business can look diversified because it has many restaurant logos, while remaining highly concentrated in one local operating system. That is not necessarily bad. Local density may be commercially attractive. The point is that the risk should be understood for what it is. A provider can be protected by local complexity and exposed to local complexity at the same time. That is why scaling a grease service business is not as simple as buying more trucks. Every expansion changes the web of dependencies. Suppose the company has found a good model in one city: recurring restaurant customers, reliable workers, a known maintenance schedule, a familiar permitting system, a workable disposal process, good documentation. Now it wants to double. The obvious approach is to copy the system. But what exactly is being copied? The truck can be copied, the cleaning process can be taught, the scheduling software can be duplicated, the brand can move. The local operating knowledge cannot simply be assumed. In another city, the cleaning trigger may differ. A different device may be treated differently. The restaurant may need a different permit. The transporter may need a different permit. The records may be different. The acceptable service provider may be different. Disposal rules may be different. That is why recurring mandatory demand does not automatically produce an easy national business. The company gets two things from local regulation at once. First, a reason for customers to keep buying. Second, a reason expansion must be done carefully. This creates what we could call a scaling paradox. The more valuable local knowledge becomes, the harder it is to pretend every new market is identical. And the more standardized the company tries to become, the more carefully it has to preserve local exceptions. The best operators in businesses like this are often not the ones that make the work look complicated. They are the ones that make complexity disappear for the customer. The restaurant manager does not want a lecture about pre-treatment regulations. The manager wants the interceptor serviced before it becomes a problem, wants the paperwork in order, and wants the kitchen to keep operating. If the provider can repeatedly deliver that outcome, the service becomes boring. Boring is good. Boring means the tank is cleaned before anyone notices it. Boring means the trip ticket is where it should be. Boring means the hauler has the right permit. Boring means the restaurant does not have to think about what is accumulating beneath the floor. We can now see the entire model as a chain. At one end is the restaurant, producing wastewater and accumulating FOG in an interceptor. At the other end is the sewer system, protected by local pre-treatment rules. Between them sits the service company. The company exists because the customer has a recurring maintenance obligation. It earns revenue by resolving that obligation repeatedly. It develops local knowledge because requirements differ. That local knowledge makes the service more defensible. But the same local knowledge has to be rebuilt or adapted in every new geography. That is the paradox. The thing that makes the business durable can also make it stubbornly local. A purely standardized service would be easier to scale, but easier to copy. A deeply local service can be harder to copy, but harder to replicate. Grease-interceptor service lives somewhere in the middle. The physical task is understandable. The compliance environment is not completely uniform. The customer need repeats. The economics depend on how well the operator turns those repeating needs into repeatable work. That final distinction matters. Recurring demand is external. The restaurant and the rules create it. Repeatable operations are internal. The company has to create them. A business can have the first without the second. If every service visit becomes a new puzzle, recurrence alone will not create a great company. If the operator can standardize what is standard, preserve what is local, and make the whole process invisible to the customer, then the strange little tank under the restaurant becomes something much more valuable than it looks. It becomes the anchor for a recurring local service relationship. And that is the final reason this business is interesting. It turns something unpleasant and invisible into a recurring stream of small operational promises. The margin is hidden inside keeping those promises efficiently. The strange margin in restaurant grease traps does not come from owning grease. It comes from owning a recurring local obligation. A restaurant has to keep fats, oils, and grease out of the sewer. The interceptor keeps filling. Someone has to maintain it. In many places, someone has to document the service, transport the waste through the right channel, and prove that the work was done. That creates recurring demand. But the same local rules that create the demand also prevent the business from becoming completely generic. Seattle is not Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not Fort Worth. A gravity interceptor is not always treated like a hydromechanical one. A small unit that can be self-cleaned in one setting is not the same commercial opportunity as a large unit that requires a specialized hauler. So, the hidden tank under the restaurant does two things at once. It keeps the customer coming back, and it keeps the operator local enough that knowledge matters. That is the strange business behind restaurant grease traps. Not a gold mine full of valuable grease, but a quiet, recurring service built around a problem that never completely stops accumulating.